Zhang Zihao wasn't one to make a spectacle of himself. Once, he'd been a photographer, one of those artists who lived for the perfect shot, who found meaning in the way light bent and twisted across the contours of the world. But that had been before. Before the accident. Before he'd been thrust into a world where the very thing he had once captured with a camera now captured him. It started on an ordinary evening, at a family dinner he didn't even want to attend. His father had been lecturing him for an hour about the death of real art. His mother, sitting at the table with that same disinterested expression she always wore when she wasn't listening, kept her hands folded neatly in front of her. There was a strange coldness in the room, like the shadows were thicker than usual, hanging between them. "You're wasting your time with that camera of yours," his father grumbled, jabbing a fork into his steak as if each piece of meat represented a lost opportunity. "Everything's done with computers now, filters, what's the point of capturing something real?" Zhang Zihao sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, trying to suppress a sigh. "I'm not taking pictures of robots, Dad. I'm just exploring light. You'd understand if you bothered to look at the way it moves, the way it shapes the world around us." His father snorted. "Shapes the world? All you've got is shadows and flashbulbs. There's no depth, no substance." He stabbed his steak again, a little more aggressively. "You're just trying to hide behind your lens, not facing the truth of your failure." A pang of frustration hit Zhang. He knew his father's words were meant to hurt, but in a way, they still stung. Photography had been his dream. And yet, here he was, arguing over it like a child with his parents, unable to escape the weight of their disappointment. His mother glanced up briefly, raising an eyebrow. "Don't mind your father, dear. He's just old-fashioned." The conversation fell into a stilted silence. Zhang's gaze drifted to the corner of the room where a lamp cast long shadows on the wall. His eyes lingered for a moment longer than usual. Something was off. The shadows, his shadows, seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if reaching for him. A shiver crawled up his spine that he blinked, shaking his head. "No, it was just the dim light. Nothing more. I'm not hiding, Dad," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I'm doing what I love. You'll see. One day, it'll make sense to you." But as he spoke, something caught his eye again. One of the shadows seemed to move, curling at the edge of the wall. It wasn't the normal shape, just a darker patch, but the way it flickered in the low light felt strange. Then, the doorbell rang. A sharp, urgent sound that cut through the tension in the room. Zhang was about to rise, thinking maybe it was just a delivery or a neighbor, when the front door swung open. A man in a suit entered, the collar of his jacket sharp enough to cut glass. He moved with an unnerving calm, like someone who was used to walking into places where they didn't belong. Zhang's mother looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for your son," the man said, his voice cold and flat. He didn't introduce himself, didn't give any context. His eyes were locked on Zhang, his gaze calculating. Zhang blinked in confusion. "Who are you?" Without answering, the man stepped forward, the door swinging closed behind him. Before Zhang could react, two more figures appeared, slipping into the room with the fluidity of shadows. The first man flashed a badge. "We need you, Mr. Zhang." Zhang's mind raced as the man's words settled into his thoughts. He had no idea who these people were or what they wanted with him, but there was no time to ask questions. His mother didn't even flinch, like this was something she'd been expecting for years. He felt a sickening twist in his gut. The man didn't explain. He didn't need to. They were already moving. One of the agents reached forward, his hand like a vice around Zhang's wrist, pulling him toward the door. "What is this?" Zhang tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, unyielding. "Stay calm," the agent said, his voice like gravel. "We don't have time for questions." Zhang's father, who had been strangely silent up until that moment, finally spoke. "It's time, son. Go with them." His father's words were cold, and there was something in his expression, something like resignation, that sent a chill down Zhang's spine. His mother's face, too, was unreadable. "Mom?" Zhang's voice cracked as he glanced at her, but she didn't say a word. She just looked at him with an expression that made his stomach turn. The agents didn't give him a choice. They shoved him forward, forcing him out the door. Zhang stumbled, trying to keep his bearings as they led him down the street toward a nondescript black van. There were no windows. No markings. Just an empty vehicle waiting for him like a coffin. When the door slammed shut behind him, Zhang was plunged into darkness. The next few hours were a blur. A blur of cold metal, sterile walls, and men in lab coats asking him questions he didn't understand. They seemed to know everything about him, his work, his past, his family. They knew the exact date of the accident, the day that had set all of this into motion. Zhang didn't remember much about the experiment, only flashes of bright light, searing pain, and the overwhelming sense of something changing inside of him. But when he awoke, things were different. Very different. He sat in a sterile white room, his head pounding. His skin felt different. A strange heat radiated from his body, as if something inside him had shifted. He could feel it in the air. The walls felt closer than before. He was aware of every single detail, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the small creak of the air conditioning unit, the pattern of the tiles beneath his feet. But then came the light. The strangest thing, light didn't behave like it should. It swirled around him, responding to his thoughts, his gestures. The very shadows in the corners of the room grew animated, rippling as if alive. It was as if the light itself had become a tool, something he could mold and shape with his hands. Zhang stared, disbelieving, as a shadow in the corner of the room twisted, rising from the floor like an ethereal serpent. It coiled through the air and flicked in his direction, as if testing him. His breath caught in his throat. You have the power," a voice said behind him. Zhang turned to see one of the scientists, a tall man with hollow eyes, standing in the doorway. His lab coat was stained with some dark fluid. What is this?" Zhang asked, his voice shaking. "What's happening to me?" The scientist's lips curved into a thin smile. "You were exposed to experimental light energy. You can manipulate light, shape shadows, create, well, anything, really. The possibilities are limitless." Zhang didn't know what to say. His mind raced. He was no longer just a photographer, no longer the man who had spent his life capturing fleeting moments. He had become a conduit for something far more dangerous. The scientist continued, almost gleefully. "You'll be trained, of course. We've already begun the process. You'll be a weapon, a tool for covert operations." Zhang's stomach churned. The words echoed in his mind. A tool. No longer a man. No longer a photographer. He wasn't sure how much time passed before they started the training. Days? Weeks? Time lost all meaning. He was surrounded by others, other test subjects, other weapons. They were taught how to manipulate light, how to create complex illusions, how to use shadows as tools of infiltration, deception, even destruction. The shadows themselves became extensions of his will. At first, it was exhilarating, being able to manipulate light in such a visceral, powerful way. But the more he used it, the more he felt himself slipping away. His own identity was no longer clear. He was something between a man and a weapon. He could create images so real they felt alive. He could make his shadows grow sharp, aggressive, like predators. And at times, when he lost control, they did. They devoured whatever they touched. But the question lingered in his mind, was he still human? Or had he become something else entirely? Something monstrous. Zhang's first mission arrived faster than he'd expected. He had barely gotten used to his new abilities, or rather, his new prison, before they had him suited up and ready for a covert operation. They gave him no time to process what was happening. One moment, he was practicing light manipulation in a small, cold room, and the next, he was standing in front of a government-issued black sedan, a pair of tactical agents waiting by the door. "We've briefed you on the objective," the man who led the team said in a clipped tone, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his posture rigid. "Now we execute. We'll handle the extraction. Your job is to neutralize any threats and create distractions." Zhang nodded, though his stomach churned. He hadn't yet fully grasped the extent of his abilities, let alone how to use them in real combat situations. The thought of being a weapon, a mere instrument in their hands, made him feel small. And yet, the part of him that had always craved control, that had loved playing with light in his photography, couldn't ignore the rush of power. They drove him to a towering building, sleek, modern, and imposing. The target was inside, a foreign national suspected of selling high-tech weaponry to unsanctioned groups. The mission seemed straightforward enough. At least, that's what they told him. His heart beat a little faster when they explained the nature of the operation. No killing, not yet. Just retrieval and neutralization. But Zhang knew better. Neutralization was just a euphemism for something far more final. The elevator ride up to the 23rd floor felt like the longest moment of Zhang's life. His mind raced. What had they turned him into? He wasn't just going to take pictures now. He was going to be a ghost in the shadows, a destroyer, a manipulator of light. As the doors dinged open, he stepped into the hall, and everything seemed to change. The target was in his office, a private penthouse suite at the top of the building. Zhang's instructions were simple: use the shadows to infiltrate, gather intel, and create chaos if necessary. He could do that. He had to do that. But something about the assignment felt wrong. This wasn't art. This was something else. The moment they entered the building, Zhang felt a familiar tug, a sensation that came with the light. His fingers twitched involuntarily, and the hallway lights flickered as he passed. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay focused. He was a professional now. He had to act like one. That they moved quietly down the corridor. The agent in front of him signaled for Zhang to take point. Without hesitation, Zhang pressed his hand to the wall. Shadows coiled around his fingers, responding to the slight gesture like loyal servants. The hallway lights flickered again, this time more dramatically. He turned toward the source, a security camera just above the corner, and the shadows surged upward. They wrapped around the camera, engulfing it, leaving it dark and useless. The agent behind him whispered, "Nice work." Zhang didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was already elsewhere, swirling with the possibilities of what he could do. The shadows in the hallway stretched, almost sentient, crawling under the doors of each office they passed. They seemed to hum with energy, responding to his will, willing to follow him wherever he wanted. They reached the door to the target's office. Zhang stepped forward, his heartbeat now a steady thud in his chest. His mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts. Was he still human? Was this all worth it? But before he could process any further, the agent behind him spoke, "Your move." Zhang's stomach clenched. He raised his hand, and the shadows obeyed without hesitation. The door shuddered as the dark tendrils around him grew thicker, more solid. His fingers traced the air, and the lock clicked open as if it had never been there. They stormed in. Inside, the target, a well-dressed man in his late 40s, sitting at a massive glass desk, looked up, startled. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He just stared. Zhang didn't give him time to react. His shadows surged forward, spreading like ink, crawling along the walls. He didn't want to kill him, not yet, but he needed him neutralized, incapacitated. The shadows wrapped around the man's wrists and ankles, pulling him out of his chair with the fluidity of water. The target struggled against the dark mass, but it was futile. The shadows held him in place, their grip tightening with every attempt to move. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Zhang said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the words were final. The man stopped struggling, his face growing pale. Zhang felt a sense of sick satisfaction, but it was fleeting. The shadows continued to tighten, and in that moment, a strange sense of detachment washed over him. This was what he had become. A soldier of light and shadow. He stepped back, giving the agent space to secure the target. He watched as they moved efficiently, securing the man and collecting the intel they needed. Zhang's eyes were fixed on the target's face, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, Zhang realized that this mission wasn't just about the target. It was about him, about who he had become in the process. When the operation ended, they left the building just as quietly as they had entered. The target was secured. The intel was in their hands. And Zhang? He had done his job. He had used his powers, his shadows, to their fullest extent. The government agents praised him for his efficiency, but there was no joy in their words. No warmth. Just cold professionalism. He wasn't one of them. He was just the weapon they used. As the car sped away, Zhang stared out the window, his reflection blurring against the glass. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man looking back at him. It wasn't just the shadows that had changed. It was him. The world outside seemed distant, unfocused, as if he had become an observer in his own life. It wasn't long before the mission started to pile up. With each new task, Zhang became more proficient, more powerful. He learned to manipulate light with a precision that bordered on artistry, turning shadows into creatures of terror, using light as both weapon and disguise. Each success cemented his role as a shadow operative, a soldier who could melt into the darkness at will, leaving only destruction in his wake. But with each mission, Zhang felt something inside him crack. The man who had once loved the dance between light and dark, the photographer who had marveled at the ephemeral beauty of the world, was slipping away. In his place stood a puppet, manipulated by forces beyond his control. Zhang's growing unease didn't go unnoticed. One night, after another successful mission, he returned to his quarters and found the door slightly ajar. He hesitated before stepping inside. It wasn't just the dim light that made him uneasy. Something was wrong. He stepped into the room and froze. There, in the center of his quarters, stood a mirror, a simple, full-length mirror that hadn't been there before. At first, it seemed ordinary. But when Zhang looked into it, his breath caught in his throat. His reflection wasn't his own. Or rather, it was, but there was something different about it. The man in the mirror looked just like him, but the shadows behind him were alive. They moved with a will of their own, twisting around him like serpents. And his face, his eyes, held a strange emptiness, a void where his humanity should have been. Zhang took a step back, his heart racing. The shadows seemed to reach for him, curling and swirling, their edges sharp like knives. He could feel them calling to him, urging him to embrace them. No, he whispered, but the word was hollow. He didn't believe it anymore. He had already crossed the line. He was no longer a man. He was a weapon. And the weapon was hungry. The reflection in the mirror smiled at him, a cold, cruel smile that sent a chill down his spine. Zhang staggered back, feeling the shadows around him closing in. It was too late to turn back now. He had embraced the darkness, and the darkness had embraced him. Zhang's transformation was complete. The man who had once manipulated light to capture beauty now manipulated shadows to destroy. His power had consumed him, twisted him into something unrecognizable. But as he stood before the mirror, staring at the reflection that no longer felt like his own, he realized the most terrifying truth of all: he wasn't in control anymore. The shadows were, and they were hungry. Zhang stood frozen in front of the mirror, the reflection of his face slowly twisting into something foreign. The shadows that had once been his tool, his weapon, were no longer content to simply follow his commands. They had taken on a life of their own, coiling and writhing like dark tendrils, crawling up the glass with a menacing persistence. He reached out to touch the surface of the mirror, his fingers trembling, and then it spoke to him. It wasn't the reflection of his own voice. It was something darker, a whisper that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "You are ours now." Zhang yanked his hand back as if burned, his pulse thundering in his ears. He took a step away from the mirror, but the shadows were already moving, creeping along the edges of the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He could feel them, thickening, wrapping around his legs, pulling at his arms. The air grew heavy, suffocating. His breath quickened, his hands shaking with a cold sweat. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was still in control. He had to be, but the more he fought against it, the more it overwhelmed him. The darkness was inside him now, a part of him that he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. He could feel the pull, the hunger. It was as if the shadows had taken root in his mind, whispering to him in a language he couldn't understand but somehow instinctively knew. He staggered backward, stumbling to the ground. "No," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "I won't. I won't let you take me." But the shadows didn't care. They were no longer just extensions of his will. They were him. And they were starving. Zhang's mind reeled with images of his past, the art he had once created with light, the beauty he had sought to capture, the fleeting moments he had spent chasing a perfect picture. All of that had been washed away by the accident, by the experiment that had turned him into something else. The photographer was gone. The man he had once been was slipping through his fingers, like light fading into darkness. With a scream, he pushed himself up from the floor, summoning the light within him. He tried to force the shadows back, to reassert control, but the more he fought, the more they pulled at him, consuming his every thought. He could feel them growing stronger, feeding off his fear, his confusion. He had no choice but to fight back. "Let go," the voice in the mirror crooned, low and insistent. "Let the darkness inside. Let it be you." Zhang gritted his teeth, his hands shaking as he reached toward the shadows, gathering the darkness around him like a cloak. He could feel the power surging through him, an intoxicating rush that threatened to drown out everything else. But something inside him, a sliver of resistance, fought against it. He remembered his photography. He remembered the light. With a forceful shout, Zhang pushed outward, forcing the shadows back. For a moment, the darkness hesitated. It recoiled, as if startled by the light. Zhang closed his eyes, focusing on that singular, pure essence of light that had once defined his art. He grasped for it, pulling it forward, forcing it into the shadows like a beacon. The shadows hissed, snapping at the light, but the light held firm, growing brighter, stronger. The air around him began to crackle, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn between two opposing forces, and then, with a final, desperate push, the shadows shattered, breaking apart like a veil torn from the sky. The room around him seemed to breathe again, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting. Zhang collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. His heart pounded in his chest, his body trembling from the exertion. The shadows were gone, at least for now. But their presence lingered in his mind, a reminder of how close he had come to losing himself entirely. He didn't know how much time passed before the door to his quarters suddenly burst open. The agent from his last mission, the one who had been supervising his operations, stepped inside. He looked at Zhang, then at the shattered mirror, and without a word, he moved to the side, his eyes flicking to the shadows that still clung to the corners of the room. "You were supposed to keep it together," the agent said, his voice cold and detached. Zhang struggled to rise, his legs unsteady beneath him. "I tried," he swallowed hard, still feeling the tremors of what had just happened. "I thought I had it under control." "But, you were never in control," the agent interrupted, his tone hardening. "You're a weapon now, Zhang. That's all you'll ever be. And we don't tolerate weaknesses." Zhang's vision blurred as the agent's words sank in. He had heard the rumors, the whispers among the other test subjects, the ones who had been through the same experiments. No one had come out of it unscathed. No one had remained human. But that wasn't what terrified him now. What terrified him was that he could feel the truth in the agent's words. He was a weapon. A tool. And tools didn't have room for feelings, for humanity. They were just used until they broke, until they became obsolete. The agent motioned for him to stand. "We've got another mission for you." Same as always. You're going to be our eyes and our hands. You'll do what you were made to do. Zhang's mouth went dry. He could already feel the pull of the shadows again, whispering to him from the dark corners of his mind. They wanted him. They wanted to be inside him. He could feel their hunger, but he didn't answer immediately. He was silent for a long moment, the weight of his new reality pressing down on him. Then, finally, he spoke. I'm not just a weapon. The agent's eyes narrowed. Yes, you are. I'm not. Zhang's voice was stronger now, his resolve hardening with every word. And I'm not going to be anyone's tool anymore. The agent stepped toward him, his face hardening into a mask of indifference. But Zhang didn't flinch. He had reached the tipping point, the moment where there was no turning back. If he was going to keep any semblance of himself, if he was going to stop being a puppet, he had to make a choice that he couldn't just be a weapon anymore. He had to fight back. Without another word, Zhang raised his hand. The shadows responded, swarming from the corners of the room like hungry creatures. The agent's eyes widened, but he didn't move fast enough. The shadows lashed out, wrapping around him, pulling him toward the floor with a force that felt like 100 hands closing in around him. The agent screamed as the darkness consumed him, but Zhang didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The shadows were no longer just a part of him, they were his power, his rebellion. They were his only chance at freedom. When the shadows receded, the room was quiet again. The agent was gone, his body nothing more than a silhouette swallowed by the darkness. Zhang stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, his heart racing. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive again, but the fight was far from over. The shadows were still a part of him, too powerful, too dangerous to ignore. They would always be with him. And so would the voice, that whisper from the mirror that had promised him everything. It had been right about one thing, that he was theirs, but he was also his own. Zhang had made his choice.